The Bible tells us in 1 Corinthians 13:13, three things will last forever: faith, hope, and love. And of this trio, you hear a lot about faith. You know, faith in the Lord Jesus Christ. You hear a lot about love, the love of Jesus on the cross, and he gave everything. And we sang about him being crucified today. And we don't hear quite so much about hope, the center or the central point of this trio. Hope. Three things last forever: faith, hope, and love. What about hope? Most of you probably don't know Annie Sullivan. But Annie lived in a different century, the end of the 1800s and the early 1900s. Annie Sullivan was a little girl. She was aged 5 when her mother died. Traumatic thing for a little girl. And her father was an alcoholic. They lived in poverty, and he abandoned the family. That meant, of course, that she and her brother, the only other sibling, would go to an orphanage. And there in the orphanage, her brother got sick and died. Now she was all alone. And she was blinded by a disease which has pretty much been obliterated in the modern world because of antibiotics, trachoma. What we know is that in her day it was fairly common, and she had difficulty seeing, and it got worse, and she became blinded. Having no loved ones, being in an orphanage, she became insane. And then, we not only know that she was insane, but they kept her in a cage in the basement behind bars in a Boston asylum because she became violent. She had all this rage, all this hostility. Can you imagine how she might have felt? Why me, Lord? And then one day, something unusual happened. This little girl who was blind in a cage in the basement of an asylum in Boston experienced something for the very first time. She experienced a nurse who cared. And the nurse brought some brownies. And the nurse, these are good brownies. The nurse left the brownies outside of the cage because little Annie was about to starve to death because she didn't think life was worth living. And so she had just about given up. She was insane, and she ate the brownies. Excuse me for a few minutes. Well, she ate the brownies, experienced the love, and what do you suppose happened? Because of the invention of antibiotics and procedures, surgical procedures, her blindness was healed. So she could begin to see again. She never saw well, but she could see again. That was Annie Sullivan. We're talking here about hope. The brownies brought her hope. Hope that someone cared. she felt like somebody loved her. She had hope, and then she had sight. Here's a picture of Annie Sullivan and a lady by the name of Helen Keller. Helen Keller was the first deaf-blind person to ever graduate from college. She was an author, she was an activist, she was a lecturer, she was opposed to war, and she was a champion of women's rights. She would never get her sight, but it was Annie Sullivan who worked with Helen Keller and gave her hope. So Helen Keller got the hope from Annie Sullivan. And with that hope, well, you know the rest of the story, right? The rest of the story is Helen Keller went on to become a famous person. And she helped many, many people. And it's all due to those good brownies. She had hope. The Bible tells us in Colossians, this is from the Apostle Paul, continue in the faith firmly established and steadfast, and not moved away from the hope of the gospel. The gospel brings us hope, because when Christ died, we all died, and when Christ was raised, we were all raised. Isn't that good news? The hope of the gospel. So the Apostle Paul later could say, "O death, where is thy sting?" Because we have this blessed hope. Our God is a God of surprises. You know, there was Abraham, and he is an old man, and God says to Abraham, "You're going to have a child." Well, that was a surprise. He didn't think his wife could have children. You know, she was past menopause. But she had a child. And then there was Moses. The Egyptian army was on one side, and the Red Sea was in front of him, and surprise, the water parts, and they go through. Then there's Joseph, and Joseph was thrown into a pit by his brothers, and then what? Surprise, he becomes the master of a household. And then later, he goes into prison for a crime he didn't commit, and then he becomes the ruler of an entire kingdom. Surprise! Our God is a God of surprises, and that gives us hope, of course. There was Daniel. He went into the lion's den, certain death. They didn't even feed the lions very much. They made sure they were really hungry. They throw in Daniel, and guess what? Surprise! The lions' mouths are shut. And we come to the tomb of Christ. And guess what? Surprise! It's empty. There's an empty tomb. Now, I have good news for you today. The good news today is that we know that there's an empty tomb. We know that Christ was raised. We know that He loves us. We know there's a gospel of hope, the good news of hope, and our God is a God of surprises. And so what issues do you have in life? You know, right now our economy stinks. So many are out of work. So many are losing their homes. So many are losing their jobs. So many have lost their retirement. And we could go on and on and on. But I have good news for you today. Our God is a God of hope and a God of surprises.